Hello from Idaho. Today I want to talk to you about motorcycle performance improvements, specifically how to measure if you're making a difference. We often take our motorcycles to a dyno tune or a dyno tune day. They strap it down to a platform. The rear tire drives a big weight, and how fast you can accelerate that weight will tell you how much horsepower you're making at each RPM. This is a great tool. So great that they're $50,000. But if you have one, or you have access to one, you can tell if you've made performance improvements. And it's a good, they usually measure the oxygen in the exhaust, so you can tell what the air to fuel ratio mixture is. And I would recommend getting a dyno tune for anybody that makes major intake changes. Intake changes typically give you twice as much horsepower as exhaust changes, and they have twice the effect on air to fuel ratio. So that's a great thing. So great that it costs you about $100 to for an hour on a dyno, and it clearly has its place. But for the Sunday tinkerer that's making performance changes on his motorcycle, it's not really practical to go visit the dyno after every change. And so there is another way. I call it the riding dyno or the asphalt dyno. Some people call it the track dyno. And it's really simple. You basically pick two spots along a road. You enter the first spot. You pass the first spot at a known RPM in a known gear. So let's say I use 3,000 RPM in third, and when you pass the first marker, you give it full throttle. And you continue to accelerate up to the second point. And when you pass the second point, you note your exit speed and your exit RPM. It's best if it's all done in a single gear. And so by doing this occasionally, first you take a baseline and you write it all down. And then let's say you read on the internet that you can have a better exhaust by taking a 1-inch hole saw and drilling up inside your mufflers. And you want to know if it made a difference. Well, when you write it, you can clearly hear the exhaust is louder, and so we all think that's faster, but sometimes it's not. And without something like the riding dyno, we'll just be fooled. Humans suffer from something called confirmation bias. Already believe. And we ignore data that is contrary to what we believe. A big thing went through corporate America in the 80s called paradigm and paradigm shift and paradigm shifting, and it was basically all about confirmation bias. So the reason I tell you this is that whether a change makes an actual difference, if we believe it does, then we'll seek out data that says it does, and we will exclude data that is contrary. But if you have an actual number off a dyno, or in my case off of a road dyno or riding dyno, whatever you want to call it, then you can actually tell whether you're making a difference. So I'm headed out to my little road dyno spot where it's a Sunday. It's about 90 degrees. All the weekend traffic coming back from McCall is passing by, as you can see. The road is pretty busy, and we may not get to make a dyno run, but I'll show you what the point is. And it's very effective. Since I've gotten this motorcycle, I've done a Zippers intake and a Bassani exhaust and iridium spark plugs, and have made a significant difference in the performance of the motorcycle. And it's shown by the riding dyno. So we're going to come up on my spot here in a little while. Got to pay attention to shifting. At any rate, it's really nice to be able to make a change in an exhaust. There's a goodie for sale, or an intake, or let's say you did drill out your exhaust baffles. You paid big dollars for an E3 spark plug or a set of E3 spark plugs. I'm going to get a little bit of a gap between me and the car in front, so that I might be able to do a dyno run for you. And we're all tinkerers. Most motorcycle people are tinkerers, and so it's nice to be able to measure the performance of those changes. In the case of drilling out the baffles, sometimes it works. Most times it makes very little difference, a difference that's hard to measure, and sometimes it actually hurts. But it's louder, so we will confirm that it is more power. A great example is drag pipes on Harley Sportsters. When you put drag pipes on a Harley Sportster, it puts a giant hole in the torque curve around 3,000 RPM. But there are those that believe, okay, here's my spot. So I would typically enter past this sign at 3,000 RPM in third gear. And I kind of screwed up and didn't do it. And then when I pass this next sign, I look down at the speedometer and the tachometer. So I'm looking at it, look down, 3,100, 58 miles an hour. Then I turn around and run it the other way and write down that number. And then I do it 2 more times. And then I get an average of that performance and write it all down in my book. Then when I get home, I can look and see how I did compared to my last performance and see if my change made a difference. Sometimes I do it without making any changes, just to confirm the reading that I got last time. We'll go up here to a turnaround spot. This will work. So anyway, I was telling you about Harley Sportsters and drag pipes. Every one of them I've ever seen, and I've seen dozens of dyno sheets, shows that you take off some sort of exhaust and you put on straight pipes, and it puts a giant hole in the torque curve until you get up to higher RPM. But it's loud as hell, and it's really hard to convince people that have done it that they just hurt the low end performance of their motorcycle in the RPM range where they mostly ride. Now, weekend traffic is something else, huh? And with a dyno sheet, you can see that. But confirmation bias makes sure, I shouldn't say make sure, confirmation bias convinces us that we've actually made an improvement because we want it to be an improvement. We spent good money on drag pipes. It sounds so good. It's got to be an improvement. And so confirmation bias says, yep, it's a performance improvement, and it sounds great. But only half of that is true. So anyway, this time we'll get at 3,000 RPM, get us some space here. We're at 31, 3,000. And here's one of the weaknesses of the technique. You have to be really good at hitting an entry RPM. Within 50 or so is fine. And getting an immediate full throttle. Okay, we're not here yet. So for me, 3,000 is right at 40 miles an hour, about 39. Here comes my sign. Okay, we're a little hot. 3,000. Go. So I think you guys have got the point now. There are some weaknesses to this system. Like I said earlier, it's really hard to hit. I shouldn't say hard, but you have to pay attention to hit the entry speed just right. And unfortunately, we as humans will anticipate passing that sign, and so you have to be careful about not going to full throttle too quick. The exit is the same way. So I typically turn my head, and when the pole is 90 degrees to me, I look at the speedometer, I note the time and the speed and the RPM. But doing it 3 times both ways, a total of 6 runs, averages out most of those mistakes, and you'll get a pretty reliable number after a little bit. That's one of the reasons why I tend to do more than one run over the course of a few days with the same setup, because I can further filter out any variances in my technique by doing it multiple times. And I keep a little logbook that shows my times and mile per hour. I shouldn't say timed, but it's basically exit speed, and mile per hour. The other thing I should mention is choosing the distance plays an important factor. 7,000 RPM in my test, and so picking two signs or two markers about that far apart is a task that you'll have to do. And you can use anything. You can use road signs, stop signs, highway signs, big rocks alongside of the way, driveways, stuff that's basically not going to change over the course of a few years. And then there's one more problem. If you end up making your bike considerably faster, let's say you did an intake, an exhaust, a big bore kit, a quick shift kit, and continue to tune it on with a fuel tuner, you can actually outgrow your runway. The distance between your two signs will become too far apart, and you'll have to shift in the middle. And so then you get to decide, do I want to include a shift in my numbers, or do I want to find a shorter distance? I typically include the shift, because if you choose a shorter distance, then you make all your previous runs irrelevant. You can't compare to them anymore. But as you saw in my run there, third gear up to about, in this particular bike, up to about 100 is within my RPM range. So from 40 to 100, and if I'm in any sort of a hurry, I'm above 3,000. When I putt around trying to keep the exhaust quiet, while I stay below 2,800. The Bassani has a fairly significant resonance at about 3,000 to 3,400, and so when I'm putting around or I'm going by the local cop or whatever, I keep the RPM pretty low. But if I'm in a hurry, I'll be above 3,000 RPM, so I'm in the band that I'm measuring with my road dyno. And so far I've been able to see improvements, big improvements by intake and exhaust. I did those both about the same time. Actually, intake, exhaust, and a fuel tune. Those were giant improvements. That was according to the dyno sheets that I've seen from zippers, that particular change is worth 17 to 20 horsepower. Well, that's 20% of the original horsepower that the bike made originally, so 20% you can definitely tell. 5% or 5 horsepower, it's hard to tell unless you're actually using the road dyno if that made a difference or not. So small things like drilling out baffles, changing spark plugs, whatnot, you can tell with the butt dyno. Or I'm sorry, not the butt dyno, that's the term used to mean I can tell by riding it, just intuitively. But you can tell with the road dyno. There are a couple more weaknesses. If you decide to change gearing, then it'll screw up your entry speed and your exit speed, and that's not bad, but it means you can't compare your runs to the prior ones with the old gearing. If you were able to change the gearing and calibrate the speedometer, then it would work. But with let's say you went to lower gearing and you started you still started at 3,000 RPM. Well, instead of going 40, you might be going 30. And so that would mess up your comparison to the old data. So you just have to start with a clean sheet and do a baseline with the new gearing, and then you could measure small changes after that. Changing the tire pressure is hard to measure. One thing you can do is tell how bad a fairing or a windshield is hurting you. There are some parts of the year where it's miserable riding without a windshield, in the spring or the fall. When it gets down to 40 or below, a windshield is a big help in comfort. And if it's raining or sleeting or snowing, yeah, I've actually ridden in when it was snowing, why then a windshield makes a big difference to your comfort. But it does mess with your total power available to the wheel, because you're pushing air, and so it makes a big difference to how fast you can go, how fast you can accelerate with a windshield on. But typically the roads are pretty nasty during the early spring and the fall, so I'm not really carving corners or doing quarter miles or any of those kind of things, so it works itself out. But another good road dyno type place is the drag strip. You get a 60-foot time, an 1/8 mile time, and a 1/4 mile time. And if you have access to a drag strip, you can definitely measure performance improvements or declines. But it comes with its own set of complications, several more than the road dyno. The first one is the launch. The launch is one of the most variable things in a drag race. Very few people can do it consistently, but when you do, it's a very rewarding. The difference in launch can make a full half-second difference in your time. The other complication in using the drag strip as a road dyno is that includes not only the launch, but a couple of gear shifts. There can be complications with shifting gears. Notably, people will run up against the rev limiter for a half a second or so before they recognize it, and then shift. And so that was a half a second where the rev limiter was keeping the engine from making all the possible power, and it just basically stalls the run at a certain RPM and a certain speed until you shift, and then you can continue to accelerate. One of the things that's designed into the road dyno is that you run both directions multiple times. So if there's a wind, or the road that you've chosen happens to be a little uphill, you run it uphill one direction, you run it downhill the other direction. If you're running against a headwind one direction, you're running it with a tailwind the other direction. And so it kind of cancels things out, and it gives you pretty reliable results. So I hope this has helped someone with their tuning dilemma. Goodbye from Idaho. As usual, if you like or dislike my video, please select the appropriate button and let me know why. I really appreciate comments, and I will answer every one. If you're new to my videos, please select the subscribe and the notification bell to get more videos like this.